Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. We are going to be joined momentarily with our guest, Robert Spencer, a man of infamy or fame, a man to be lauded or criticised, depending on your perspective. I think he's actually one of the heroes rather than one of the villains. And as you can see, we're going to be talking about the question of what can Christians, or for the remainder of our conversation, the church, do in response to Islamization. Just a clarification. This is not about hate mongering on Muslims as a people, or tarring all Muslims with the same brush, but it is talking about the process of increasing Islamization of culture, politics, economic, society, moral, customary norms, and the ascendancy of Islamic law over others, in other words, Sharia law. So I want to be clear, we're talking about the ideology and the increasing influence, power, and authority of that ideology over our lives. Though, of course, we recognize that there are Islamic militants and there are people that wish and are active in this process. And, you know, they are a part and parcel of the discussion. If you like what I'm doing and you want to support what I'm doing and you want to see more live streams like this, have a look in the description box to see how you can support me. Please always do it prayerfully, not from an emotional spasm or because you feel guilty or something, but because you've done it with prayer and you've decided that works for you, or that God has led you in that way, rather. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to bring in Robert. Merry Christmas, Robert.
Merry Christmas, Bob.
I know you're having a good Christmas. Did Saint Nicholas bring you the things that you asked for?
Yeah, you know, it's been a very interesting time as always, and I'm grateful to be here.
Thanks be to God, and we're grateful to have you here. This is the second time you've been on my channel. I thoroughly enjoyed it the first time, and this is go on. Sorry.
Oh, I just said likewise. Yes.
Yeah, and I've talked about this topic before with others, but I really want to get your input on it. However, before we begin, as always, let's start with a prayer, and you're going to read a psalm for us as our prayer.
This is Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has wrought desolations in the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow, and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. I thought that
This
would
is
be
the word.
an appropriate beginning because, of course, our friends in Islam traffic in intimidation to a tremendous degree, much more than people realize. They always want to put their opponents on the defensive, make them uncertain and afraid. And so it's important to note that however formidable the foe may appear to be, ultimately he will not prevail.
Amen. And I confront Islamists on a regular basis, and just last Sunday, actually, they tried trolling, harassment, and assault because I was calling the church to rise up to the challenge of Islamization. And I think we probably should just start off by making a few distinctions. Obviously, there are Islamists and there are Muslims, and Muslims fall along a spectrum that includes Islamist at one extreme, and then cultural, even reformist Muslims on the other extreme. And then you have to measure up which of in that entire spectrum is actually living according to the doctrines and the religion. I try to give a sort of summary of Islamization in the intro, but how would you summarize what Islamization is?
What Islamization means to any country is the increase in the first place of the Muslim population, which does not have any necessary consequences in itself, but unfortunately, because inevitably there will be among the Muslims who come to the new land some who believe that they need to impose Islamic law and that they have a responsibility before Allah to impose Islamic law, there will be some who will begin to put pressure upon the infidel society to adopt Sharia provisions. And that would be, in particular, restrictions on the freedom of speech in regard to criticism of Islam, in particular, and restrictions on the activities of women and their ability to move about and handle their affairs independently. Those are the first lines of attack. And as the political power of the Islamic groups in the country grows, then there will be more aspects of Sharia that will be implemented. For example, we see in Nigeria, which is about half Muslim and half Christian, large-scale efforts by Sharia authorities to destroy the consumption of alcohol. Now, Christianity, of course, does not forbid the consumption of alcohol, and Islam does. And in a country where there are both Muslims and Christians, there should be an understanding that this is going to be sold, this is going to be available, and it's not something that anybody should object to. Obviously, they're free not to buy it and not to drink it, should they so choose. But in Nigeria and elsewhere, also, we have seen thousands of bottles of alcohol broken by authorities who believe that Islamic law must be extended over the non-Muslim population as well as the Muslim population. And now it's very important that we understand the implications of that. A lot of people will see that and think, well, I don't approve of alcohol either, and alcoholism is a terrible thing that destroys lives, and so I applaud these authorities. But this is apart from that moral evaluation. We can have that discussion, but that's for another time and place. The issue here is whether Islamic law ought to be extended to the non-Muslims.
Or even Muslims that reject it.
Yes, exactly, because of course, it must be noted that in Nigeria, where alcohol is sold, there are some Muslims who buy it, as well as Christians and others. And so their freedom to do so and not to observe the Islamic tenets is likewise transgressed upon. Another aspect of Islamization is the manipulation of the idea of religious freedom. For example, in the United States, there was a couple of years ago a case of a physician in Dearborn, Michigan, who was performing female genital mutilation. And this was in line with, of course, the teachings of the sect of Islam to which she belonged, the physician. When she was arrested and put on trial, the whole thing was dropped by a judge who invoked the principle of religious freedom and said that because this was part of their religion, which interestingly enough had always been denied before the case came to the courts. In other words, every time there was a story about female genital mutilation in the American press, the press report would say, this doesn't have anything to do with any particular religion, it's a cultural practice. But when this physician went on trial, she said, well, this is all about my Islamic observance. And so the judge said, well, it's her religious freedom. Now, this is a very dangerous idea, because if you start to grant exemptions to observances of other laws based on the principle of religious freedom, then where does it end? Can someone say, well, I can wage jihad against infidels and kill them or enslave them because that's part of my religion? And you can't stop me because that would be an infringement upon my religious freedom. Obviously, there needs to be a rational discussion of what the parameters and limits of religious freedom are. And it would seem to be just basic common sense to say that where the existing laws are contravened, that's where religious freedom ends. That religious freedom, in other words, is not a license to break the laws. And people who believe in whatever religion may wish to change the laws, as we have seen in the abortion controversy and so on. And that's all to the good. But to simply ignore the laws and behave otherwise in contravention of the laws should be something that any reasonable society would rule out on the basis of the necessity to maintain the rule of law. So Islamization.
So let's jump. I can tell we've got a bit of a time delay between me speaking and you hearing, and that's probably mutual. So let's jump in on the Nigeria example, because I'm studying the history of Nigeria as part of a series that I started, and I need to finish. And one of the things that's come out from my studies in that is that Christians, where they pursued any kind of political agenda in Nigeria, pursued the agenda of maintaining a secular state, whereas Islamists, when they pursued their political agenda, pursued the agenda of increasing Sharia law. And over the years since Nigerian independence, along with other illegal activities like, slaughtering Christians by their tens of thousands, the Sharia strategy has been winning out over the secular strategy. And it seemed to me that there is a danger amongst Christians that they think if we just maintain a secular state, that somehow that will protect us. It's the policy being pursued in France. It's the policy, I think, that will be pursued in America when this becomes an issue in America. But it has failed in Nigeria. There's arguments that Ali Jinnah wanted to set up a secular state in Pakistan. It failed there. And so it seems that history is teaching us that the pursuant of a secular liberal state is no bulwark against Islamization. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And we see it elsewhere also. For example, in India, the same thing happened. And I believe actually you just alluded to that. Pakistan was established as a secular Muslim country, but quickly Islamized, and India remained a secular state. And now there is tremendous pressure being exerted by the Muslims in India for ever expanding concessions. And so it raises the question, when you have this example of India, of Nigeria, of Europe, whether a secular state can withstand the challenge of Islamization.
And go on, I'll let you finish your point.
Well, I'm not sure the answer to that can be positive, that there isn't any example of a secular state taking in a sizable Islamic population and remaining secular. It's never happened in human history, nor is there any secular Muslim state in human history. People will say, well, there's Turkey, but Turkey is clearly a failed experiment. It was founded in the context of the rejection of political Islam, and now the secularism is being rejected and political Islam is being re-implemented. So I don't know that it can be said to be a successful effort at secularism in the Islamic context.
And I think that is the key issue, is that well, let's dig into that a little bit more. Do you think that the issue is secularism per se, or the liberalism that is usually connected to the secularism? In other words, can we imagine a different kind of secularism? Or should we throw out, as Christians, should we give up on the idea of secularism in its entirety?
I think that we can imagine a different kind of secularism, but it might not be anything that would be able to deal with this challenge any more effectively. What I mean by that is this: when you have a principle of the equality and tolerance of various perspectives, religious perspectives and religious groups, but then one of them is inherently supremacist and intolerant, then how can it possibly fit into that kind of a mutual tolerance framework? So even apart from the suicidal aspects of modern day leftism and the apparent desire of the political and media elites in the West to destroy their own countries, even if you take that out and go back to Peace of Westphalia kind of secularism, you've still got this problem of tolerating a radically intolerant, aggressive, supremacist, expansionist, and violent worldview.
I mean, for me personally, in terms of suggesting a solution, and I'd like to hear what you think about this, is I think that Christians as a whole need to envision an idea of a new Christendom, a new muscular Christian culture that impacts politics, economics, society, customs, in a way that, because it is a muscular Christianity with a clear sense of its own identity, will not tolerate acts of Islamization, even though it may very well tolerate Muslims.
Yeah, well, that sounds great.
Have I won you over? I was expecting a bit more. Do you agree?
I don't have any problem with that. I mean, I've been a very strong proponent all this time, for 30 some years now, of the idea of non-establishment of religion, because it seemed to me to be the only solution to the problem of Islamization. To say that, to postulate at the outset and make it very clear to the Islamic community that we are establishing a state here that doesn't have a particular religion, and it's going to allow you to practice your religion within the parameters of the law, as we touched upon before, but not to indulge in the aggressive and expansionist and supremacist aspects. And I'm not really sure, as I get older and as I see all these things happening, I'm less convinced that that's even possible.
Well, I mean, that's the model that the French Republic's trying at the moment. It's trying to be a muscular secular state, but it's failing. Because the thing is, for a society to continue, like, to say that we're having a state that is a-religious is in some way vacuum, but it is also in other ways, it is a kind of religion unto itself. And the problem with it is that it doesn't speak into the rest of human life. If it says that there are other areas of human life that should not be touched by the state ideology, then what it does is it gives room for its very foundations to crumble. And
Yes.
that's what's happening in the French model. So we're
There's
seeing
there's nothing that holds it together. There's nothing
yeah,
that stirs your heart or commands your allegiance. You know, I'm going to put my life on the line for nothing in particular. It's never happened in the history of the world that people would
yeah,
do that. You know,
yeah.
as it happens, I just finished a book. It won't be out for many months because they hold them for so long. But later this year, I'll have a book out, a history of the Byzantine Empire.
Mm,
And one of the things that I found most fascinating about the Byzantine Empire was that at its best, in its best moments, the emperors actually made real efforts to make the people better. Now think about that in comparison to our culture and governments today. Nowadays, because we have these kinds of anything goes, grab bag, secular governments, they end up being taken over by the ideology of the people who dominate them. And because they're of the cultural left, they end up funding all these things that Christians can't abide and that Muslims, for that matter, can't abide, and that the Muslims are determined to ultimately thrust aside. In the Byzantine Empire, for example, there was an emperor who he bought rather a big house, a big mansion, and he said any prostitute who wants to give it up can come and live here.
mm,
And your expenses will be paid. And he got people to take them up on it. It became a kind of a monastery, kind of a convent. Um, But imagine a state, in other words, where the government tried to make people better instead of indulging them in their worst impulses. But you have to
yeah.
have
And
a high
I
view for that.
I worked in community development in another life, and my experience of liberal approaches to community development is it's totally structural, devoid of values, devoid of a value system, devoid of an inspiring vision of human nature. It's just purely, well, if we create the right structures, the right institutions, the right environment, then people are going to suddenly become good. And it clearly doesn't work, which kind of brings me a little, I guess, to our the enablers of Islamization, which I would suggest, and is or your progressive militant left. It's not necessarily that they share the same values as Islam, but rather they share the same hatreds as Islam. And for that reason, there is a synergy of minds between the Islamist on one hand and the progressive on the other, not because they're actually fighting for the same things, but they're fighting against the same things. And I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, they are, yeah, they are fighting against the same things. But I would also suggest that they're fighting for the same things as well.
Go
That
on.
you have, in both cases, totalitarian entities that want to control every aspect of the lives of the people. And
Hmm.
so they see themselves as kin as a result of that. The left, the radical left, wherever it's taken power, first institutes a reign of terror and destroys its enemies. And then it keeps people in line with the gulags and the thought police and all the apparatus of the totalitarian state. And it's in service of creating what they say is going to be a just society on earth. Sharia works in exactly the same way. You have Islamic law that is supposed to be the perfection of human society, the best society, the best way to order society that you could possibly have on earth. And it's enforced by a reign of terror. That is, if you get out of line, you'll be beheaded or stoned to death or have your hands and foot amputated and so on and so on. That's the reign of terror aspect. So they're establishing the earthly paradise by a reign of terror in both cases.
I mean, I don't want to get too caught up in that discussion, but I would say that whilst their mechanisms, like the how they achieve what they want to achieve, is the same, and the structure, like how they want to control people's lives into the minutiae detail, is the same, the value systems and the doctrinal systems that they're working to are very different. You know, the progressives are Epicurean. As G.K. Chesterton said, it's a virtue gone mad. You know, it's the sense of justice that keeps landing on different things and then just exploding into fanatical spasms of virtue signaling obsession. Whereas Islam is very much a totalitarian regime that seeks to establish a dictatorship where there is a single Muslim leader. It can never be anyone else, always is a male, never can be a Christian, and where Islam dominates every area of our lives, whether you're a Muslim or not. And so I think their similarity is kind of like how Nazism and communism look very similar to one another at so many levels, but yet they had really key differences. That's what I think about that. But I think in terms of responses to this challenge, it's more about liberal Western society has created a vacuum, and if we want to stop Islamization, we have to fill that vacuum in a way that the progressives currently have, because the progressives have filled it, but they retreat and give ground to the Islamist. Yes. Whereas what we need to be doing as Christians is to fill the vacuum that everyone else is trying to fill.
Absolutely.
So how would you describe what that vacuum is? How could we describe that vacuum so we know how to fill it?
Well, people have all sorts of material possessions, but they don't have any reason to live. And this is the key appeal that Islam offers actually in the West as well. And that has made for many converts who become especially fanatical and often turn to jihad because they embrace this as something that finally makes sense of their lives and gives them meaning. And so they end up becoming much more devout and observant than a Muslim who's born into it and is used to it and has breathed the air of it every day. So you have converts becoming some of the most virulent jihadis. But that's the vacuum. You know, to look at John Walker Lind, he's probably the first and most famous of those converts. He is the Marin County Mujahid, he was called, the young man from Southern California who went from here to Yemen and then ultimately to Afghanistan and was caught shortly after the U.S. troops went into Afghanistan, fighting alongside the Taliban and Al-Qaeda against American troops. And as news came out about his upbringing, it was clear what had happened, that his father was gay and his life in Southern California was rootless and aimless, and he was looking for something that would give his life some significance and that would make it worth living. And he found it in Islam. He didn't find it in Christianity. And this is very important. Why didn't he find it in Christianity? I think primarily because the Christians, particularly in Southern California, although certainly all over the world, but particularly in the West, they don't offer a real, clear, viable alternative to the prevailing culture.
And I think
often they want to accommodate the prevailing culture instead of offering an alternative to it. So people who are looking for an alternative to it, they go elsewhere.
And you know, like, I don't know if you know what I talk about on my channel, but I have this a phrase that I'm constantly banging on about, it's this idea of muscular Christianity. And what I mean by that is that as Christians, we reorganize our communities, our sense of self, our identity to fully embody and embrace a Christian identity. So we, through study and relearning the traditional faith, we follow Christian ethics, which are virtue ethics. We follow, Christian customs and traditions, not the systems of the world. So, for instance, me and you, we spoke about Christmas is still going on, but according to the rest of society, Christmas is over. We embody, we take on church history as our history. We see ourselves as Christians, and we see the first point of our unity and our identity, and the first focus of all our political aspirations as being about what stands in solidarity with other Christians and what helps the church to advance the kingdom of God. And if people push against that, then, we stand up for ourselves and we embrace, the possibility of martyrdom as something to be received with joy, and that we don't compromise. And if we upset people, we upset people, and we accept that conflict is inevitable, and we don't shy away from it. Do you how do you see the Christians responding to the sort of challenges and problems that you've just described?
Well, responding not
in
really,
terms of the cultural rootlessness that's created by liberal society.
well, if Christians were really interested in doing that, they could do it very easily. They could address the secular culture at every pressure point and offer an alternative. They could, in other words, take, for example, the transgender madness, and they could go to the people who are pushing that and say, we believe that God created human beings, male and female, and that means something, that is a core element of your identity to the degree that you would be transgressing against your true self, not discovering it, were you to engage in this kind of mutilation and hormones and all that. And that you will find, if you go into the understanding, the study of the implications of your physical reality, you will discover things that have to do with your spiritual reality. And that's just one example, but there's so in every place where the left is advancing today, the Christians ought to be out there addressing the issues. And yet most of the time when I see I can tell you, I've never heard a sermon in all these in the last few years. Certainly before that, we wouldn't have expected to, because it wasn't an issue. But in the last few years, with all this gender madness, I've never heard anybody address it in a local church.
Yeah.
Why not? This is the kind of thing people are thinking about.
Yeah.
And maybe it's amplified online, and it's not so much a thing that ordinary people are thinking about. That's fine. I understand that. So don't talk about it every week. But there ought to be some availability in every church for people to be able to go and see, well, what exactly does the church say about this?
And I think the key
issues of this kind.
And I think one of the key problems that we Christians need to wake up to is that a lot of the weakness that we have is because of the structures that we've accepted, in terms of the structures of the organization of the church. Firstly, we are, divided, and Reformed churches particularly divided ad infinitum. So, you might have three churches in a town that are right next to one another, but they don't work together to push back, say, against transgenderism, or they don't work together to push back against abortion, or they don't work together to push back against Islamization. The other problem that they have is that the kind of models of church that we're using don't lend themselves to confrontation, because many of our churches either work as a club, it's a social club, and you don't want to create an environment that's offensive, because that doesn't help you get members, because that's what's going to pay the pastor's wages, or they end up being merely religions that serve a civic function. So it's like to bless Veterans Day, to bless Memorial Day, to bless other Independence Day or Thanksgiving Day, to use a list of American examples, but we've got them here as well. So civic religion, and they serve the practice of civic religion. Or alternatively, they just make themselves into an NGO that's dedicated to fighting a particular cause of poverty. And I think that all of this slaps of a lack of a full embracement of a Christian identity and a full embracement of a Christian worldview, and the inability to re-envision a political Christianity, that reaches back beyond the Peace of Westphalia. And people need to go away and research what happened at Westphalia if they don't know what we're talking about. And so I was wondering, do you think that a political Christianity has a role, a part of the solution in dealing with Islamization? And if it does, in what way, what form do you kind of see that political Christianity taking shape?
Well, that's very, there's all sorts of aspects to that question, because I think immediately when you talk about political Christianity of the Christian political parties that used to be a feature of the various countries of Europe, like the Center Party in Germany before Hitler, and the Christian Democrats that used to be really Christian, and so on. And it became just another political party. I don't know. I'm not really sure about a political Christianity in terms of running people in elections and so on. But certainly there needs to be a Christianity that would be unafraid to speak out about the various political issues of the day, and to not to shy away from the controversies, but to go toward them and to offer a real Christian voice. And so there might be, I'm sure there would be, occasions in which one group of Christians has one point of view about it and the other has another. And then, well, in a perfect world, they would work it out with one another. But even in that kind of a situation, you at least have people being offered a Christian perspective, and maybe more than one. But the big problem that we face in that is the proliferation of the idea, the dominance really of the idea of dialogue. And nowadays, all of the various branches or sects of Christianity, they all go for this without any exception, or without any major exceptions. Every last one of them thinks, well, we just need to sit down and have a conference and talk it out. And this creates an atmosphere in which Christians are afraid to deal with any controversial issues, because what they want to do, they say, is build bridges, and not antagonize anyone. Now, that doesn't ever win anybody over, because you end up just being wishy-washy and not standing for anything. If you stand for anything, you're going to antagonize certain people, unavoidably.
I see.
Attract admiration and following from people who are glad, are relieved that somebody's finally speaking up and saying what needs to be said about some particular issue where the left has been running with it for decades without any challenge.
And I think that's something that, limp-wristed, cuckold Christianity, or let's call it churchianity, because that's what it is, needs to wake up to, is that you'll be more respected if you stand up for who you are than if you don't. And we need to recover that. It's not like Christians have never stood up for what they believe in. It's like it's only since the Enlightenment that we've increasingly become timid and shy. And I think that in terms of doing that, again, it comes back to structure, because if an individual like me or like you, a brother in Christ, you've been standing up against Islamization for, I don't know how long, but it's been quite a long time. How many years have you been standing up against Islamization?
let's see, probably about getting up to 40, but certainly publicly for about 20 now.
Right. So an individual like you, who is standing up against Islamization, is easily lampooned and squared away into a corner as some kind of xenophobe or some kind of racist, of some kind of bigot, and it's easy to lampoon an individual, but because they stand out as an individual. But if thousands of people collectively in a similar area, in a similar geography, are all saying the same thing, it becomes far harder to push against that than it is to square off an individual. And this has been the great folly of many, I think, who want to stand up for the church, is that we're not recognizing the structural dynamics to how you can be isolated and pigeoned off by the media. And we'll come to media distortion in a second. And I actually think that one of the solutions to this issue, have you ever heard of the Benedict option?
Yeah, I'm not a fan.
Right. So I would say to you that the Benedict option is actually part of the solution. Because if you were inside a nestled community, say of 5,000 people, who, even though there might be some disagreement and even though there might be a spectrum of belief within that 5,000 people, that town of people all believe the same thing, it would be far harder to come after you. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, it wouldn't. If you have a big leftist behemoth authoritarian government, they can come and clear out a place like that in a day.
Well, then you just increase the number.
What's that?
You just increase the number.
Well, sure. That would be nice. Sure. But then you're talking about the Christianization of, or re-Christianization of the society at large.
Yes.
And that would be fine. But I don't think that they would leave us alone. This is my big problem with the Benedict option. We all go away and form our little community. They're not going to, the left is totalitarian, and so is Islam. They have to have the whole thing. That's what totalitarian means. Total. They have total control over your whole life, and they want total control over the totality of the world. So consequently, if we leave, they will come after us.
Right. Hold on one second, because when I talk about the Benedict option, I don't imagine the Benedict option as is that of us just consolidating and then retreating from the world in the hope that the world will just suddenly ignore us or suddenly decide to join us. When I'm talking about the Benedict option, it is in combination with the kind of muscular Christianity that I described earlier, which is this idea of a consolidated Christian community that is missionary, not frightened of confrontation, is willing to stand up for itself, and that believes and practices in solidarity amongst Christians, and also is working for the triumph of the church, i.e. the re-Christianization of the whole of society.
All right.
So that's the kind of Benedict community that I'm talking about. And the reason why I would suggest that it works, and I want to give examples, is I'll give you two examples from America, and then I'll give you some from the UK. So in America, one of the fastest growing Christian communities in the USA is the Amish community. Now they're just doing it because they have loads of kids, and their whole community is set up to establish families and to build large families. The other one is the Mormons in Utah, who are both, these are two examples of communities practicing the Benedict option, and they're both growing communities. Some examples from the UK. Obviously, we've got Muslims. They practice the Benedict community in the UK, and it makes them very hard to tackle. It means that they get to dominate their local culture, their local economics, their local politics, their local society. And the state often backs off because it's scared of the confrontation. You've also got the political examples of Benedict options. You've got Unionists and Republicans in Northern Ireland who are political examples of the Benedict community vying off against one another. and they've maintained solid identities in the face of opposition to one another for a long time. And you've also got the Orthodox Jewish community in the UK that also practice the Benedict community and is the only example of Judaism that's growing in the UK. So I think sociologically, the case is very sound for the idea that the Benedict option with a muscular Christianity is part of the solution to the challenge that we face. Feel free to say what you like about that. I'm hoping I've won you over.
Well, sure. I mean, really, then what you're speaking about in terms of historical Christianity is just the component of monasticism combined with the presence of Christianity in the culture. And nowadays, of course, because we have Protestant communities that don't consider themselves monastic, they become kind of semi-monastic communities of their own and form these little groups like the Amish and so on. But really, it goes back to the same impulse. It's a component of what makes for a healthy Christian society. But it seems to me, well, I can't say that I'm an expert on the Benedict option, but what I've heard of it seems a bit quietist and inclined to withdraw from the world, in a sense that people tend to think that they're going to be left alone, and they won't be.
Yes, I agree that the man that wrote the book is assuming that, but I don't make that assumption. I actually have your assumption that they won't be left alone. And the kind of the Benedict option that I'm talking about is a far more aggressive Benedict option. So far more aggressive in the sense of being outwardly focused and wishing to expand.
In terms of being aggressive,
aggressive in quote marks, not like thuggish. I want to be clear.
No, robust, standing up for who we are.
All good words.
Not willing to give way.
Yeah.
This is altogether to the good. And it's interesting to note, a few years back, I remember that I was in touch with some atheists in Europe, and they were saying Christianity was the problem because Christianity taught to turn the other cheek and love your enemy. And in doing that, Europe had opened itself up to mass migration and Islamization. And I thought, well, this is based on several faulty premises. One is that Christians in Europe did this when it was clearly post-Christian secularists who did it all. And also, it's worth noting that when Christianity did have a robust sense of itself, it resisted Islam in Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was on the basis of Christianity that it did so. So, yeah, there needs to be a recovery among Christians of that kind of Christianity and not the all-encompassing weakness and undifferentiating openness that characterizes all too many Christians today.
Yeah, undifferentiating openness is something that I think needs to be unpacked, because I'm a religious studies student as academic training, and we would call these the difference that we would talk about there is the difference between a soft religion and a hard religion. So a soft religion, for example, would be like classical forms of Hinduism. It's like, oh, you have a god, I have a god too. Great, I'll embrace your god as well as my god. But then what ends up happening is if that god is monotheistic, eventually you lose the other gods that you embrace and you get chewed up by the monotheistic. Whereas a hard religion or a hard religion of difference is one that emphasizes the things that make me me, not the things that make you and me the same. And religions, soft religions, are, you just demographically, they always get chewed up by the hard religions of difference. Because if you're practicing a soft religion or a religion of humanity, as it can sometimes be described, all you're doing is emphasizing what makes us all the same. So it doesn't matter whether if you're a Christian who has this attitude, you try to look at what makes Jews, Christians, Buddhists, Sikhs and atheists all the same. And you don't try to argue any difference. You just try to argue about, oh, we're all the same. But in that milieu, you're totally defenseless in your ability to defend your religion from critique, and when it is critiqued, you often collapse in the face of that critique, which is what's happening to lots of Catholic parishes at the moment, because they're following that exact thing.
Catholic parishes have not been taught. See, this is a good example of what we were discussing before. The Catholic parishes collapse in the face of these challenges because the Catholic leaders aren't telling them how they should meet these challenges. The Catholics are only taught that Islam is a religion of peace and there are brothers in monotheism and so on, and so there's no reason to be concerned about mass Muslim migration or the presence of the mosque down the street and so on. And then when they are confronted with Islamic proselytizing, they don't have any idea how to deal with it.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So that's really a soft religion. I would respectfully disagree with your invocation of Hinduism as a soft religion, because the Hindus are fighting back to a tremendous degree against Islamization in India.
I was talking about, sorry,
the world, as a matter of fact, because of that, but it doesn't seem to be intrinsic to Hinduism at all to lay down. I'm no expert on it, but the ones that are laying down, unfortunately, are the liberal Christians in the West.
I'm talking about classical, like not the sort of Hindutva modern movement that we're seeing. I'm talking about classical Hinduism of the past, before the Hindutva kind of movement.
Well, I would suggest you read my book, The History of Jihad, and you'll see about the jihad against India. The jihad against India was fought quite fiercely, quite virulently, in defense by the Hindus for centuries. And it was very much even more violent there than in Europe.
Yeah.
Because the Hindus were not people of the book. But anyway, getting far afield, the question is, how can the church become more robust and stronger in the face of these things? And it has to reject this whole idea of dialogue and this idea that we need to focus upon the Vatican II idea for Roman Catholics, but it's a larger issue than just Roman Catholics. The idea that we focus on what we have in common, like you were saying, rather than what we differ upon, and that we don't bring up what we differ upon because it would be impolite and so on. You just get run roughshod over by the people like the Muslims, who are not at all ashamed of being different and proud of it and happy to explain to you why you should be different as well.
Yeah, and this is the point. It is about creating what academics would call a hard religion of difference, or for Christians to rediscover that we need to put the emphasis, we need to press our hands down on the keys that strikes the tune that says that we are different from you, as in we have our own identity, we have our own sense of self, we have our own community, and no, it isn't yours, and no, therefore we're not going to let you walk all over it. It's like we're going to defend ourselves. And we're going to stand up for who we are.
But that's not what's happening. I go around in this area, and of course it's a notoriously leftist area of the world, but nonetheless, I see churches, and out in front of the church there's the rainbow gay flag, hanging there on the church. And it's rather a signal that they're saying, we're not going to give you a prophetic voice. We're not going to tell you any truths that might make you uncomfortable. We're just going to reaffirm the worldview you already have.
Yes.
And then, so what's the point?
And I think, again, that is a structural issue. And this is the dimension that I think Christians are missing. And it's why I talk about it a lot. Because if you have an institution, an organization, particularly a larger one, at some point, if your intrinsic demography collapses, i.e. your true believers, as it were, collapses, you have a choice. You either collapse your institution to match your population, or you change and mold your institution to be more accessible, presentable to those around you. And the reality is that the lots of churches, when they're faced with this choice between collapsing their institution or making themselves more amenable to the surrounding world, they choose to go to make themselves more amenable to the surrounding world because they think that that's the way to be relevant. It's also by necessity because they're trying to keep the institution open. And for smaller churches, it's because that's how the pastor gets his paycheck. So if his congregation collapses underneath him, he doesn't have a job. And so the issue is a structural problem that is addressed by the Benedict option. Because if you consolidate Christians into a geographical space where they dominate the local environment, the congregations do not feel the pressure to change. Or rather, the leadership doesn't feel the pressure to change because they're not faced with the choice of, if I don't do this, I lose a job, or if I don't do this, the institution disappears.
All right.
Hopefully I'm going to win you over onto this this idea, Robert.
There's more to it than that. I'm very skeptical also because I happen to have had interactions with the author of the book years ago, and I know that he doesn't have a clue about the jihad threat and doesn't consider Islamization to be anything to be concerned about. And that makes me skeptical, I have to confess, about his whole endeavor.
But I agree with you in your criticism of him and his idea of the Benedict option. But that's not the idea of the Benedict option that I'm talking about.
Well, all right, you need to write the real Benedict option book.
Mine's just an appendix stuck on the end that corrects all the sort of quietist, let's be quiet and live on our own and hope the world will ignore us or accept us kind of attitude. But other than that, from a sociological point of view, I really think he's onto something, which I guess I'd like to bring us on to the issue of, and again, I want to focus on solutions rather than discussing problems. But we touched upon earlier the idea of how liberalism is enabling Islamization. So, and a large part of that is to do with media distortion. And so one of my questions is, what kind of examples of media distortion are you aware of, and what can Christians do about it?
Well, there's media distortion practically every time there's media. The media is a propaganda machine for the left. It's not a news organization, they're not news organizations. So you want an example, there's so many, really. I can tell you one that immediately leaps to mind is about Nigeria again. In Nigeria, there is vicious persecution of Christians happening on a more or less daily basis. Now, even the Nigerian press is wary about this because in Nigeria, you have an Islamic president who is a member of the tribe, the Fulani, that is preying upon the Christians. And so the media doesn't want to say who these people are, but I have many contacts in Nigeria, and they tell me when these news stories come out and it says bandits attacked a church, that the bandits are Islamic jihadis who want to establish a caliphate, terrorize the Christians, and so on. But in any case, I report on these stories from Nigeria at Jihad Watch pretty much every day. And none of these stories ever make it into the establishment media in the West. And the reason why is very clear, that they have a narrative. And the narrative is that Christians are white and racist and oppressors with a history of colonial oppression, and that Muslims are brown or black and are victims. And there is never a story in the mainstream establishment press where Muslims are the perpetrators. Even when there's a clear Islamic jihadi yelling Allahu Akbar, then the police are trotted out to say, we aren't sure of his motive, and we're looking into that he had mental illness. And there's some exonerating factor, in other words, so that it fits the narrative.
So how?
Media is all about just pushing a narrative. That's all, not about telling you the truth.
Totally, and how it doesn't tell a story, like how it'll focus. It wants to talk about Islamophobia. So, like Trudeau in Canada, one mosque gets some graffiti on it or a pig's head thrown at its door, which I utterly condemn, by the way. And Trudeau's all over it about the horrors of Islamophobia. But then 30 odd churches get burnt down in Canada, and Trudeau's like, oh, well, we've got to try and understand the people that are doing this. So Mr. Potato is a fantastic example of the media double standard. But how then can Christians, what do you think Christians can do about this media manipulation?
Well, we need to bring down the machine. And that's a long-term, multifaceted effort. But ultimately, I mean, I'm doing what I think can be done at this point on the spectrum, and that is to try to create alternative media where you can find the truth. And then, so I have Jihad Watch, and I'm scrupulously accurate and scrupulously careful. And then you go to Wikipedia and you read, Jihad Watch is a far-right anti-Muslim conspiracy site. Well, no, actually everything we say is very carefully documented, and the explanations provided, links provided, and so on and so on. And so these are the obstacles that we face in trying to do that. But we have to try to first get the word out, and ultimately to continue to push back on these machines, this media machine that pumps out all these falsehoods. And ultimately, one day, probably not within my lifetime, but one day it will fall.
I think we also, I totally agree, and I just want to say for public record that I laud the fact that you have kept a spotlight on the persecution of the church over the decades, because the plight of the persecuted church is something that's deeply woven into the very matrix of my Christianity, and the fact that they are ignored by liberal progressives and the self-enlightened, the enlightened, to use that old insult, is a demonstrable fact that they're willfully ignoring the plight of the persecuted church because it doesn't fit the narrative they want to create in the West. But I think part of the solution is to really be confrontational about the hypocrisies and the double standards that liberals are creating in their narrative, and using the examples of the persecuted church and literally throwing the plight of our brothers and sisters in the face of these liberals until they suffocate on it, in every TV program, in every interview, in every political discussion. Wherever a Christian has the opportunity, they should be throwing this at them and challenging them about their silence.
Well, there's the rub right there, because most of the time you don't get an opportunity.
But you do get some.
Yeah. But they don't put us on because they don't want the narrative challenged. And so this is the big difficulty that we have now, is a matter of access, and that only one point of view is aired, and generally only one point of view is allowed.
Yeah. But I think when we do get opportunity, we should take it. And ultimately, I think you're absolutely right. It's about bringing down the mainstream media. And that means not funding them. So, if you're in the UK, stop paying your TV license, not buying their newspapers, not clicking onto their websites, and calling them out on every forum that you can.
Yeah, I do that, and I think it's
I know you do.
And I had, well, I'm not looking for points. I'm just saying that I have a friend who says, they don't care. They don't know if you're watching or not. And so what's the difference? And I thought, well, the difference is that if I do it and you do it, and 100 other people do it, and then 1,000 and 10,000, then at a certain point, they are going to feel it.
Yeah.
And so I'm willing to step out and be among the first.
Yeah.
But I hope that other people will follow.
And I think that brings us to another one of the key issues of the response to Islamization, which is about organizing. You talked about earlier about pressure points, about confronting liberal culture on all of the pressure points. And I think as Christians, we need to do a better job about organizing ourselves to fight the battles of those pressure points. And an example of that would be the well-organized pro-life movement in the US, the UK. It's the one example that I can think of where the church has reasonably got its act together. And because it's reasonably got its act together, it's actually having some success. In other words, it's a multi-dynamic movement that's fighting the battle on multiple fronts, using multiple tools, is well resourced, is well funded, is well manned, and of which there is broad consensus amongst the church. And for Christians to really defeat Islamization, we need to have the kind of organization in the pro-life movement, but pointed against Islamization. And it's that lack of organization that means that people like me and you just stand out as individuals and are lone lions fighting against a pack of hyenas on one side, and then, the rabid liberal progressives on the other.
Well, sure. Because, see, you're absolutely right, of course. This is what is needed. This is what's been needed for all these years. But why do we have it? Well, we don't have it because in the churches, they would say, oh, these people, they're Islamophobes. They interfere with the dialogue. As a matter of fact, that's exactly my experience. A few years back in Massachusetts, I was invited to speak at a Catholic conference. And then I was disinvited by the local bishop, Robert McManus, who said that if I spoke about the persecution of Christians, it would harm the dialogue with Muslims.
Yeah.
And so, well, what's the dialogue for? What is it supposed to be accomplishing? If you have a dialogue where you can't bring up uncomfortable issues, then it doesn't then it's useless. But he didn't obviously see that, and he canceled the talk. I'm sure he's never said anything about the persecution of Christians himself. And so the point is that the people who are in power in the churches, they don't want this point of view extended. They don't want it spread among the Christians. They want the Christians to think that there's no problem of Islamization at all. And that there's no problem of mass Muslim migration into the West.
Yeah.
So they're fostering a dangerous complacency and ignorance among their own people.
But I think that, like, that bishop, he controls the institution. But on any given Sunday, I bet I speak to more people than he does. In that, one of my YouTube videos will get watched by, depending on which channel it lands on, could be up to 10,000 people in a week. I bet you there's not 10,000 people going to his congregation. That's the first point.
The problem is,
wait, Robert. The second point that I would make is that you raise a really valid point, which is that our leadership is useless. And I think Christians need to be really political about taking over the institutional parts of the body of Christ, the institutional church.
Yeah, that's
so that
true.
We get on the PCCs, we get the vicars to become the bishops that are teaching the faith. We stop funding bishops like, what was his name again?
McManus.
So, like, don't get behind anything McManus says or does. And when we find an example of a good bishop, I don't know if you've got any that come to mind. Do you have any? No. That's a shame. There was a legate in Rome that argued that immigration to Italy should prioritize Christians. He's passed away now. I forget what his name is, but he would be an example. There are Christians, like there's a bishop in in the UK is from Pakistan. I think he's actually joined the Catholic Church, but he used to be a bishop in the Anglican Church.
Ali.
Yeah, Nazir Ali. He, God bless him. He's constantly stood up about this issue, and we need to get behind those leaders. As Christians, we need to get organized behind good leaders and disassociate ourselves from bad ones. Because I guarantee, when their money stops flowing into their treasuries, they will ask the questions why.
Oh, yeah.
And it's all about using everyday sociological pressures to influence and change the culture within the church.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about having the guts and the gall and the balls to do that.
Yes, indeed.
And not to jump on my sermon, but I feel that we're in complete agreement on this. So this will be my last point on it, is that we need to organize to take over the institutional elements of the church.
Oh, yeah, but that's a matter of generations.
Yes,
we're
it
only
is.
now seeing in the 60s, the hippies announced the long march through the institutions, and nobody paid any attention or took them seriously. But now they control everything. Now they're 65 years old, 70 years old, and they own the whole world.
Yeah.
And so they did it. And now we have to take it back. But it's going to take another 50 years. Who knows what will be left by then beyond a smoking ruin.
Well, I agree, but I would, and I'm going to plug it again because, I hope to change your mind on this, but an aggressive Benedict option will make that happen quicker.
Okay, is that what, I mean, this is what this show is about?
No, it isn't. It isn't. It's just that it really isn't. I promise you, it's exactly what it says in the title.
I know too much about Rod Dreher.
Yeah, but that's Rod Dreher, not Bob.
His total strange, contradictory, and Pollyannish attitude toward Islamization, and
yes.
being taken in by these sharpies and deceivers. What's the name of that woman? Kanta Ahmed, and he was touting her and praising her, and she's whining about Islamophobia, playing all playing the same game that they always play, playing victim and saying that it's so terrible how Muslims are victimized. And see, this is a big temptation for Christians like Rod, because they think, oh, well, these people are fighting the secularists just like we are. But she's not saying that she's victimized by the secularists any more than she would say she's being victimized by the Christians in another context. Her whole game is to advance Islamization by breaking down, by intimidating people into being afraid to resist it because they'll be called Islamophobic. And so whether it's the secularists or the Christians, and the Christians, they fall for this. Like recently in Michigan, there were a bunch of parents, Muslims, at the school board meeting in Dearborn, and they were protesting very virulently against the LGBTQ agenda in the public schools. And all these conservative Christians I saw saying, hooray, we can work with these people, we can ally with these people, and we will fight the secularists with them. Well, that's great, but this is very naive because they don't understand that the Muslims will work with them as far as they're useful, but not any farther. And it's not going to make them discard the supremacist, aggressive, and violent aspects of Islam that call for the subjugation of Christians.
I totally agree.
And disparages and defames those who do.
I agree with everything you say 100%, and I want to reassure you, this is not a bait and switch. I promise you. The point of this talk is exactly what he says in the title. I want to give you that utter confidence. You have my word on it. But in one move, and I agree with all of your criticisms of Rod Dreher and all of your criticisms of his idea of the Benedict option. I 100% agree with you on that as well. But I think that a person, just because they might be wrong in some aspects, doesn't mean that they're wrong in everything. And I honestly believe Rod Dreher is onto something. It just needs fine tuning. And my point is that I would say the Benedict option in one move allows us to address in one move multiple problems all at the same time, of which we're talking about a whole bunch, multiple challenges all at the same time, and that's why I'm bringing it up again and again and again, not because I'm baiting and switching, but because I actually see it as like, if you imagine a response as being a network of events and a network of actions that plethora out in different directions, political, economic, social, cultural, to name a few, but the list is longer. The Benedict option allows you to address all of those things at the same time, so long as it's combined with a muscular Christianity. And that's why I raise it. I happily debate it with anybody. And to be fair to Rod Dreher, if by chance he should happen to see this, he's more than welcome to come back and debate you. I'm sure you'd be happy to debate him.
Oh, I'd be happy to debate him. I'm sure he won't talk to me.
Right.
The way it all goes. I've actually written several articles about all this, and I don't know if he's seen. Maybe he hasn't seen them. We used to be in touch years ago, but he hasn't deigned to respond. There are sometimes people who are just not interested in the
dialogue. They're not interested in dialogue. It is ironic that is how the wimpy Christian goes about. It's like, oh, dialogue is so important, but then if you're the wrong kind of person, it's like dialogue with you is out of the question.
Oh yes, that's absolutely true. Yeah, the left Christians talk about dialogue, but they don't really mean it. They mean they want to talk with people who are just like them. They don't want to have any real give and take with people who disagree with them. And actually, I've had experience of that also with McManus and other Catholic bishops, when I had the same thing happen in other places and was dropped from various events. And I would say to the bishops, let me come at my own expense to your place, and we'll have a meeting, and I'll answer all your objections and deal with any problems that you may have. Give me a chance to clear my name. And they never even responded. Not one of them even responded to that offer. They don't want to have any real dialogue at all.
It's because they're cooked. They're frightened of conflict. They're frightened of confrontation. And that's the thing as Christians. That's the churchianity that we have to lose. We have to lose that churchianity and rediscover Christianity, because Christianity is not conflict averse. The saints of old were deemed to be criminals. They were martyred. They were arrested. They were imprisoned. They weren't the good guys according to the surrounding culture. They were the bad guys according to the surrounding culture, which incidentally, Brother Spencer, that is exactly what you are. You're the bad guy. But yes. I see you very much as a champion of the church. Which kind of brings me, I think, to this trend. And there's been a bit of a tone of it, I think, even in the way that you spoke. And I'd like you to speak into it more, which is a conservative defeatism. There is a tone amongst many conservatives that all is lost, that we should give up, or nothing can be changed. We are beaten. It's all too late. We should throw up our hands and just get on quietly with our lives and despair and grumble and whinge and complain. How would you respond to that tone of conservative defeatism?
That it's false, that it's not, it's far worse than that and not as bad at the same time, simultaneously. It is far worse than they think. And the problem is far more advanced than most people realize. That is true. But at the same time, there are some important indications of pushback. There are more and more people who are waking up every day. There is more awareness in 2023 than there was in 2013 of what's going on. You said I was a bad guy. When I was made into a bad guy and demonized and marginalized and silenced, nobody stood up. Everybody said, oh yes, the conservative establishment said, we will not have anything to do with him because the left says he's a bad guy. And that was taken for granted. That's what conservatives did in those days. Nowadays, that would not happen. Nowadays, conservatives are onto the whole cancel culture business, and they stand up to it. And they don't allow the left to dictate who they can associate with and who they cannot. And so there's been a real change in that. Also, many people are aware. There's a tremendous widespread awareness of this strange, nobody has a real a word for it that everybody agrees on, but the swamp or the deep state, the globalists, the socialist internationalists, the World Economic Forum, the people who are the supranational entities that the political establishment is all working for in various countries.
The Western village of elites.
Yeah, the people are aware of it. And here again, 10 years ago, they were not. Elon Musk bought Twitter and is restoring the freedom of speech. And I think one of the most instructive aspects of that is how readily people acquiesced to the silencing. And somebody would get banned, and then and they would, oh, what they get banned for? They said men can't become women, so I won't say that. And everybody was being accustomed to cowardice and submission. And then suddenly this guy starts pushing back, and everybody grows a spine again. And it just shows we have to keep standing and keep pushing back. And ultimately, this will be, because human beings are an imitative species, helpful for others. And they also will stand up. And the more we stand up, as you know, then the more likely the whole thing will break.
Amen. And, you know, this is what Paul said. He said, imitate me as I imitate Christ.
There you go.
And this is, as Christians, we need to draw our strength from Christ. We need to draw our strength from our Christian identity. We need to be inspired by the martyrs of old. We need to be inspired by the Crusaders. We need to be inspired by the Byzantine emperors who, from the 9th to the mid-10th century, pushed back against Islamization, freeing Antioch. You know, what, sorry?
Longer than that. The first siege of Constantinople was in 675.
Yes.
So 675 to 1453, nearly 800 years. They held the line. There would be no Western world. We would not be having this discussion if it were not for the Byzantine Empire.
Yes.
It's that they stood between the West and Islam.
Yes.
And they took the constant jihad onslaught, and they ultimately broke. Yes, but it was after they broke, only after the West was robust enough to be able to resist on its own. If they had broken, if they had been defeated in 675, then we would probably all be Muslims.
And they arguably only broke when the West betrayed them.
Yes, that's right. That's another big part of my book.
Which is, you know, it underscores for me historically how sectarianism, you know, Christ wasn't lying when he said a house divided against itself will fall. Yeah. And the church seems to ignore that. The church seems to think that we can be divided and that we'll still win. No, Christ wasn't lying. He meant what he said. As Christians, we have to be united cross-denominationally on these pressure points that we need to fight together, of which
all the way through. It's a thread running through the book that I just wrote that'll be out 8 months or so. It's as the West and the East, that is Rome and Constantinople, or what we would call today the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, as they grew progressively more estranged and more separate from one another, then the West started to see the Christians in Constantinople and the empire as alien, and made it conditional that they accept their theology before they would give them military aid. And so this is a primary reason why ultimately they were not able to hold out against the jihadis in the end.
Yeah, I totally. We're having a bit, at least on my side, I'm having a bit of internet disruption. Are you still hearing me fine?
Yeah. Actually,
on my side.
Soon I have another show. So
okay, when do you need to go?
About 15 minutes, probably.
About 15 minutes. Would you be happy to take some questions if we can get some questions in?
Yeah, sure. Let's go.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, at this point, if you want to ask a question to Robert or myself, and because Robert's been here for only got 15 minutes left, I suggest you ask them to Robert. I would invite you to put at Bob. If I don't see at Bob, your question will not appear. You might as well just be talking to yourself. So put at the @ Bob, so I know that it's a question for Robert. And do yourselves a favor, whilst he's answering the question, don't type a question because it will disappear in the chat and I will lose it. Wait until he's completed an answer before you ask a question. Okay, so now this is your chance. If you want to formulate your questions, write them down. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you, Robert, for coming on and discussing this with us. I just want to again say that I think if you look at the fact that within the Catholic Church, we celebrate Lepento as a great Christian victory, and it's part of the Christian calendar. And we have many saints who were involved in the Crusades, and many saints of the Byzantine Empire also fought against Islam. It's actually part of our history as Christians and our identity as Christians to resist Islamization. And it looks like we've got our first question in. If it's a silly question, I will remove it. I hope it's not. Does Robert or yourself believe we, the church, should go back to observing his Sabbath day? That's off topic, so that's not getting answered. Try to stick to the topic. Stop bringing your agenda into my live streams. What does Robert think about the future of Islam? Will it get stronger or weaker?
Yes. Will it get stronger? Yes, because it's like a shark. A shark has to move forward and eat or it will die. And so Islam always moves forward. It's the shark of world religions. It always has to conquer new lands and subject the native people to dimitude and collect the jizya from them. And then it can enrich themselves at their expense. Enrich itself at their expense. Once they're impoverished, then it grows poorer again until it can conquer a new land. And so it keeps moving. So yes, it will get stronger. At the same time, it will get weaker because of shows like Bob's and because of all the rest on the internet that's never happened before in human history, that so many people had such ready access to material that challenges their faith. And so people can watch this in Saudi Arabia, people can watch this in Yemen, people can watch this in Afghanistan and Iran, and they can find that maybe the faith is not exactly what they thought it was.
And I think the solution is, because, Islam is by an ideology always wants to advance. The solution is always to push it back. You always commit yourself to always pushing it back. Thank you very much, Abel. That was a great question. Prof. Yaffle says, what do you think individuals can do?
Individuals, depending on your talents, depending on your time, depending on what you have available to you, you have to make a stand where you are. And this is very important. You have to become an activist. You can't say, oh, Bob's going to take care of it, or Spencer or somebody is going to handle this for me. Nobody is going to take care of it for you. And so whatever's happening in your area, whether it's Islamization, the proselytizing for Islam in public schools, whether it's the LGBTQ business or trans madness, you have to push back in any way that you can and not let it all go by and accept it.
And I would add to that we need to network, because a group is always stronger than an individual. And we shouldn't leave individuals fighting this battle on their own. We all need to start working together, and we need to create the organization necessary to push back against the liberals who will oppress us and attack us, but also push back against Islamization. So that's something I would say individuals can do, is organize. Let's find another question. says Ron, but it's obviously Robert. What does Robert feel we have to do to stand strong in this day and age?
Never compromise on your faith because of social pressure. For example, there are people who will say that if you have somebody who's insane in front of you saying, well, I'm really a woman, if I were to come to you and say, I'm a woman, then you should have me committed. You shouldn't say, oh, well, what does she think about this? In other words, don't play along with this nonsense. And that's just one example, of course, of many. In the field of Islamization, you can stand strong by standing up and resisting it. And people will say, oh, you're a bigot, you're a racist, you're an Islamophobe. And you explain to them, no, I'm worried about the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is dedicated, in its own words, to destroying Western civilization from within. This mosque has Muslim Brotherhood ties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And keep making the stand. Explain your position and stand on it, and do not acquiesce to being intimidated into silence.
And I think a necessary building block for that solidarity, that stance, is that we Christians rediscover the beauty of martyrdom. We rediscover the beauty of suffering for our faith, becoming the confessor, and that we honor and laud those who are martyrs and those who are confessors in the faith, and that we rediscover Christian solidarity, i.e., unity and allegiance to one another as a people of God, to make that kind of stance feasible. Okay, good question there, Thafox. Next one, Prof Yaffle again, using the best of her time. I know who she is. How do you respond to Bob's comment on sectarianism?
You got to remind me what it is. I'm sorry.
That sectarianism is part of the problem and is leading to our defeat, and that actually with Christians across different denominations need to work together to fight the battles of the pressure points that you mentioned.
Yeah, actually, this is why we got onto the Byzantine Empire, and I was talking about my book, because one of the primary lessons of the history of the Byzantine Empire is how the temptation of the Western Christians to view the Eastern Christians as alien, as schismatics, as heretics, whatever, it prevented their sense of Christian solidarity from offering them aid. And so we have to get through that, whether by joining together. Of course, that's a very vexed and difficult issue, but certainly by recognizing at very least that all of us are fellow Christians and that we have more in common than we do with anybody on the outside of Christianity, and consequently we should work together when it comes to issues where the church meets the world.
Amen. I think just as an addition to that is, I don't know if you've ever studied it, but the 1700s was a prime example of how nationalism also becomes a point of division. So, Western powers in the Crimean War fought against Orthodox Holy Russia that were seeking to liberate Christian land and Christian populations and defend Christians, and wanted to take Constantinople. And Western powers for national interest, like France and the UK, fought on the side of the Ottoman Turks. And I think nationalism also should be recognized as one of the causes for which Christians have and still do betray their fellow Christians. And we need to.
Absolutely. That's always a temptation in Orthodoxy, among Orthodox Christians, that the ethnic identity is seen as the primary one over one's Christian identity. And then you have the antagonism nowadays over the Ukraine war between the Moscow Patriarchate in Russia and the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople. And a lot of that has to do with the chauvinism and ethnocentrism that the Russians are exhibiting in this conflict, which is not to say that I'm making some statement about that war. That's a whole other thing.
Yeah, but it's definitely a danger for Christians that we should be aware of and avoid. church over nation, basically. If fighting for your nation means betraying Christians, then like the martyrs of old in the Roman Empire, you simply refuse to fight your fellow brothers and sisters. I think this question is on topic, but it comes at it from a theological perspective. So, Robert, you go first. Can't you see that both of you are talking about here is the great apostle?
Next
Are
show.
you needing?
Sorry,
Are you,
I have to apologize. I got the time wrong on this, and so I have another show coming right up. But anyway, yeah, I think that's very possible. I always hesitate to make eschatological statements because I don't know, and I also know that throughout history, people have said, "Oh, this in Revelation, this refers to our own age," and then it turned out not to, or at least not in any final way. And so I hesitate, but certainly I do see there's an awful lot that starts to resonate in Revelation with what's happening now. Anybody could see that who reads the book at this point and then compares it to what's going on in the world.
Robert, I know you need to go. I hope that your next show is as successful as this one. I want to thank you for spending your time with us, and I pray that God blesses you and all that you do for His holy church.
And you as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion.
Take care. God bless. Think about what I said about the Benedict option. God bless you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, brothers and sisters, you've just got me for the last 20 minutes, so I will continue with your questions. To this question, I think that it is harmful for the church to try and wrestle with these questions from a theological perspective sometimes, in that it stops Christians from thinking about solutions. If you say that this is prophecy, you essentially tell yourself that there's nothing you can do about it. And that is always a dangerous mindset. And sadly, lots of Christians, when they're dealing with these deep, broad problems, the only coping stone, the only category that they can try to filter them through is some kind of prophecy or some kind of end times narrative. But the problem with that is, if you truly believe that, well, why are you resisting it? And that's a problem. I think that there is a danger that we theologize issues and topics that we should be thinking about through other matrices like sociology, politics, economics, and so on and so forth. Sometimes a broken fridge is just a broken fridge. I don't need to exorcise my car from a demon because it's broken down. And I don't think I need to worry about end time prophecy, because history will pan out as God wants it to pan out. What I need to do as a Christian is to think about what is my Christian duty in the here and the now. Let God sort out history. I need to sort out what I do in my present. And that is kind of my response to that. It's to say I'm ambivalent to the question, and that I think really it's a side issue. What really matters is what we do about the present circumstances that we face, not worrying about or even trying to speculate about whether it's end time prophecy. Let's have a look. No, it jumped. Bear with me. Okay. So Rob has gone, so I'll have to answer this. What does Rob feel we have to do to be strong? I think we have spoke about that, or at least what I would say, what we need to do is we need to unite. We need to organize, and by that I include the Benedict option, and also to take the lessons of the success of the pro-life movement and apply it to other issues. We need to train. Absolutely important. You can't do anything unless you train. We need to mobilize, and that means being an activist, as Rob said, and that's the only way you can resist. Let those be your watchwords. What does Robert think individuals can do? given he doesn't think the Benedict is anoputiob. I don't know what that means. Maybe you're just very articulate with some fancy words there, Prof. Yaffle, but he's not here to answer that question. And since the only person that is now answering that question totally believes in the Benedict option, not necessarily in the same tone that the original author described it, but in a different tone. Yeah, I think the Benedict option is the one move that we can make that deals with so many issues. It deals with the crisis of family in the church, the fact that we're not creating families. It makes that easier. It deals with the fact we're economically, culturally, and politically powerless because we don't have the numbers to influence anything. It makes organization easier. It makes networking easier. It makes the cross-pollination of good ideas easier. It leads to stronger communities and the creation of Christian culture where the individual is strengthened by the whole, and then therefore allows that individual to resist liberalization. An example of this would be, another example of the Benedict option would be, I forget which state it is in America, but the town is called Moscow in America. They're doing a Benedict option there, and they're really rubbing up against the liberals, because they're having an impact. And that's the point. Like, your individual parish church has no impact because you are a tiny island surrounded by an ocean. So why don't you become the ocean that surrounds the island? It's just basic common sense, guys. There's nothing mysterious about this. And it is the response. It is part of the response to Islamization, to be sure. Consolidation is the watchword for Christians at the moment. How do you see the future of Christianity? The church will survive. The church will survive. That is Christ's promise. I think things are going to get worse before they get better. Sadly, a lot of Christians have still got to wake up, and a lot of Christians have still been raised on milk toast theology, and they think about Christianity as a way to make friends, and to have a bit of a community. We've got to really change the churchianity that we all live by, and so things are going to get worse before they get better. But as a Christian, I cannot work from a position of defeat. Hope is a virtue. Hope in God as an end is a theological gift of the Holy Spirit, but hope as an attitude of spirit is a habit of life that a Christian should work by. And it's not senseless hope. It's not this idea. It's not fantastical hope. This idea that if I flap my hands hard enough, I'll fly. It's that belief that even in the face of great opposition, even in the face of certain defeat, my actions can make a difference. Like the Alamo, for example. They all lost at the Alamo, but the Alamo became a battle cry for the Americans. Do you know what I'm saying? In their war against the Mexicans. Incidentally, I think the Mexicans were on the side of justice probably on that one, but that's a different story altogether. The point is that even in defeat, your defeat can make a difference. The martyrs, in a worldly sense, were all defeated, but their defeat inspired the Christians to stand strong. So as a Christian, I can't accept that my actions are worthless and that they will do nothing. I must act as if my actions can make a difference, because that is what it means to live by hope. And that is a Christian virtue that we should cultivate. Romulus, where's the best place to buy Robert's books? I don't know. Do a quick Google search. Just put in Robert Spencer's books. He's done loads of books. I actually intend to buy a bunch of them myself. Now I can. like the politically incorrect guide to the Crusades. I think that was one of his books, or to Jihad and the Crusades. Get it. It's a great book. I've heard nothing but good about it. Robert Spencer is, I mean, like everyone, he's not perfect in his every pronouncement, and I don't want anyone to think that he is. But he is thinking outside of the liberal narrative and the liberal mainstream. And that is something that you need to tap into, because the liberal mainstream is covering up the persecution of Christians. It is covering up the harassment of Christians. It is against the church, and the church has real enemies, and it's time that we all accept that. There we go. When raised the idea of muscular Christianity, I agree with your stance, or what we must be is resolute, but what do you think of the classical concept of a nation of priests? It's not a classical concept, it's a biblical concept. And what it means is that we as Christians are a nation. You're not British, you're not American, you're not Nigerian, you're not French, you're not Spanish, you're not Portuguese, you're not German. If you're a follower of Christ, you are a nation of priests. You are a nation. Church over nation is the mantra that should be guiding Christians' thinking about politics and about our interaction with the nation state. The nation state, if it is against the church, is not something that we should support. The church is what we should support, and strengthening the church is what we should support, even against the nation state that we are born into, because we are born again into the kingdom of God. And as priests, it's because we are to offer up our lives as living sacrifices to advance the salvation of the world. And that means if you're going to offer up yourself as a living sacrifice, you have to be willing to suffer. You have to be willing to pick up your cross and to follow Jesus every day. That by pouring out your life as a libation, you advance the kingdom of God and you advance the cause of the church. And this should influence the understanding that we have of our own identity as Christians. What does the end game look like? The end game is Christ returning and establishing the kingdom of God on earth. If you didn't mean something, if you meant something else, you're going to have to ask a better question. Sorry, George. How important is really knowing your faith to the pushback? Absolutely essential. Lots of Christians have a very narrow spectrum through which they think about their faith. They think about their faith through very few categories. And we need as Christians to every category that you can think in: ethics, history, culture, society, politics, economics. Those are the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. You've got to think about, what does discipleship look like in that category? And the reality is that we're only going to be able to form a full fat, robust Christianity if we live it together as a people, if we have a sense that we are a people. And knowledge is absolutely essential to that, which means that the study of the faith is essential. So study what Christian ethics is, study what Christian history tells us. Like, history is massively important to this, because as you frame your past, it helps to influence your present. Study how the church has understood the Bible. Study what Christian political models of the past were, so that we can envision what a Christian political model for the present would look like. You've got to engage with the culture around you, but you've got to engage it from a distinctively Christian perspective. So the more you can understand the contrast between Christianity and the Enlightenment, the better. and it's not the watered down, thin Christianity that has reconciled itself to the Enlightenment that we need to be following. It's a full fat, robust, confrontational Christianity that says that we are better than the Enlightenment that we should be embracing. Let's have a look. Another question. This will be the last one. Sorry, I need some water. I'm going to just start coughing if I don't have a drink. Oh, wait, that's not even to me. Sorry, that's someone talking to someone else. Well, you got a bit of free screen time there. What is the name of Robert's book again? I think it's called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Jihad and the Crusades. Something like that. Let's have a look. If there are any administrators in the room and you see people trolling or blaspheming, please do put them on timeout. And if you see someone who you feel needs to be removed and you're an administrator, please contact me about their name and I will make sure that they are blocked once I've reviewed what it is that they've done. Okay. Oh, yeah, that was a good question. I forgot. I didn't get a chance to ask Robert. And I would invite you to put into the comment section below who you think that I should talk to next. And I'll see what we can do. And more importantly, if you guys really think that I should be speaking to someone, go and tell them and try to make it happen and try to help to make it happen. Because one of the things as Christians we need to recognize is that in the last couple of years, Islamic Dawah has taken on another level, helped along by well-meaning but unwise decisions by certain leading celebrities, even ones amongst the church. And, you know, if we want to advance evangelism, we need to evangelize the movers and shakers of this world. You know, think bigger. Christians don't think that the only way you can do evangelism is you preaching to one individual at a time or going onto a corner and shouting at everybody, which incidentally is a terrible way to do evangelism. We've got to engage the culture from a distinctively Christian perspective. And it's more important to evangelize the Jordan Petersons, the Andrew Tates, the Tommy Robinsons of this world, than it is to evangelize the person that you meet on the street. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you shouldn't evangelize the person you meet on the street. Of course you should. But I'm saying that in terms of a strategy, it's far more important to be evangelizing the movers and shakers of the world than it is the average Joe. And I think Christians have fetishized the way that they do evangelism, and that fetishization of the way they do evangelism has limited their effectiveness in terms of their success. And I'm afraid that is going to have to be our last question. I want to thank you all for coming. I apologize if you've asked a question and we haven't managed to get to it. God bless you and God bless your work. I haven't got any of my Bibles with me to close in a prayer. So I'd invite you all to open up your own Bibles and to read a prayer there. God bless you. And again, if you've enjoyed this, if you think that these are the kinds of conversations that we should be having in the church, and you want to support me to facilitate having more of these conversations, then look in the description box. And if after prayer you feel that you can support me, then please do so. But obviously, if you don't, feel no pressure. God bless you and good night.